Please take a seat. Hello. Excuse me, sir. Merci. Dear colleagues, our next item is a public hearing on the protection of undersea cables in the Baltic Sea. Subsea infrastructure, such as cables and pipelines, are increasingly the target of hybrid activities by malign actors, notably Russia and its allies, which threaten the security and supply of communication and energy to the EU. In order to brief us on the latest developments and to discuss possible responses, I have the pleasure to welcome here today Christian Büger, professor at University of Copenhagen and research fellow at the United Nations Institute for Disarmed Research. Wonderful that you're here. And connected online, we have Sophia Besch.
Yeah, she's there.
Okay, she's there, okay. Senior Fellow European Programme Canopy Endowment for the International Peace, and Alexander Lott, researcher at the Norwegian Centre for the Law of the Sea at the University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway. I will immediately give them the floor, starting with Professor Büger. Could you give us an overview of the latest incidents and provide suggestions to mitigate the threat posed? You have the floor about 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation to speak here today. And I would like to give a broad overview where we are with critical maritime infrastructure protection in the European Union, or perhaps better, in European waters. And to just give you a very brief background, in 2022, actually ahead of the Nord Stream attack, we published this report, Security Threats to Undersea Communications Cables and Infrastructure, Consequences for the European Union. And I really would like to invite you to read it. I'm not going to repeat what is written in there, but it lays basically out 25 recommendations, and out of these 25, 3 actually have led to actions. I think it's time also for the others to be paid attention to. I also would like to alert you to our most recent report for the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, which provides a comprehensive assessment of global maritime security, and critical maritime infrastructure protection is a very, very important component to that. Without giving a lengthy overview on what is currently happening or what has been happening in the Baltic Sea, I hope you are all aware of that by following the news. Let me firstly talk a little bit about the context. Why are we talking about this today? First of all, we need to be aware that there has been a massive expansion of critical infrastructures in European seas, and much of that has been actually linked to the green transition and our need to produce green offshore energy. And here I'm talking about wind farms and the electricity cables that come along with that. This increasing industrialization of European seas creates new vulnerabilities. And the expansion of cable systems is an essential part of it. Now, if we are looking at the series of cable cuts that occurred in the Baltic Sea, which includes electricity cables and pipelines, I think it is essential that we do not only treat this as a regional seas problem, as a Baltic Sea problem, but it is a wider European problem, and similar situations could occur in other European seas, whether that's the North Sea, the Mediterranean, or elsewhere. What we're looking at the moment in terms of context is also a tit-for-tat and signaling game. And I really would like to invite you to see the cable cuts that happen in the Baltic Sea as part of the larger problem of how we handle maritime security. And that is, in essence, the question of how we respond to the Russian shadow fleet. And here we can clearly see that some of these cable cuts have been directly responses in us going after the shadow fleet. What we're looking at are also incidents which will always be in the gray zone, where it will be very, very difficult to establish whether it actually was an accident or whether it was an act of sabotage. That will be very, very hard to resolve, and that is part of the feature of these kind of incidents. Now, if we're coming to the current solutions, since 2022, the Nord Stream attacks, a lot has happened, in particular in the Baltic Sea, but also in the North Sea. For now, the response is clearly dominated by NATO, which raises the question of what is the EU's role in critical maritime infrastructure protection. A lot has happened on information sharing and improving surveillance, including through 2 dedicated centers by NATO. So that has been rapidly improving, and in many ways I was impressed by how well information sharing and the identification of suspected vessels now works. From the Waipeng 3 incident in autumn last year, we could see that the communication with the industry is still too slow. It took almost half a day for the cable company actually to alert NATO, too slow. Operational coordination, you've seen this over Christmas, in the meantime works relatively well. The problem here is that we do not have the right legal provisions actually to detain and arrest vessels, so that needs urgent attention. In the Baltic Sea, the cables were repaired relatively quickly, but if we are looking at European seas much more broadly, we can clearly see that there's insufficient repair capacities. The repair fleet of the cable industry is aging, and this really requires regulatory solutions. Within the European Union, we have a new expert committee. It met in May, but we have not seen any outcome in terms of guidelines for subsea data cable protection yet. So here we can clearly say this process is going way too slow. Now let me come to a couple of more concrete solutions and perhaps also low-hanging fruits in terms of how we in Europe could do better. And most of these are directly derived actually from the 2022 report. First of all, on the level of information sharing, we need to make sure that the common information sharing environment led by EMSA, which has made a lot of progress over the last years, actually features in critical maritime infrastructures. The same goes for the European Defence Agency's MARSUR network, the military component of it, which is also so far not closely surveilling maritime infrastructures. Secondly, I would like to flag the commitments that European Union member states have actually made in the European Maritime Security Strategy, which is to conduct a European Union-wide maritime exercise. This has not happened so far, but I think it's an essential component to actually improve operational coordination among European navies. It should happen in 2025. A key problem in the responses to the incidents in the Baltic has been the lack of clear interpretations of the law of the sea, in particular if it comes to what can actually be done in the exclusive economic zone. And there's a clear absence of a common understanding within European Union member states of how the law of the sea, in particular the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, should be interpreted. That in many ways calls for a European Union-wide expert body solving and addressing the question of how European Union member state laws can actually better harmonize. There's also a need that we can see established in the Baltic Sea for creating clear handover procedures between European Union maritime security agencies, whether that's navies, coast guards, or maritime police. It radically differs across member states, but we need to have procedures for how to hand over suspects and evidence from one jurisdiction to the other. I think there's also a strong case for Europeanizing some of the investigations that are needed in cases of infrastructure accidents / sabotage. And in many ways, this calls for creating dedicated investigative teams within the European maritime security agencies. And this in particular calls for actions from Frontex, which is after all the European Coast Guard agency, let's not forget that, as well as the European Maritime Safety Agency. The capacities, the seagoing capacities are there. In many ways, what we would need is a dedicated investigative team that could fly in, inspect the accident instantly, and could issue a European report. Last but not least, and I'm coming to the end here, I would also flag the importance of the European External Action Service and the diplomatic process that is required to protect cables. We have a new expert body in the International Telecommunication Union that requires support from Europe, and there are also certain opportunities to flag and discuss the topic at United Nations level, which includes the UN Security Council, but also the UN General Assembly, for instance, for the last 5 to 7 years, has been frequently called for better cable protection. Europe is connected to other countries through these cables, and this is why it's of essence not to think about it as an internal problem, but also as a global problem. These are my concrete recommendations, low-hanging fruits in many ways, and I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Now over to Dr. Besch, who is joining us online. We would like to hear more from you about the vulnerabilities of the EU subsea infrastructure network and ways these vulnerabilities are exploited by hybrid activities. You have the floor also about for 10 minutes, and welcome, and now we could see you. Please.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the invitation, and good morning from Washington, D.C. I hope you can see and hear me all right. Now, in my remarks, I want to focus on responses, and I want to start by saying that it is clear to me that the last 2 years have obviously been a crash course for European authorities on how to protect their subsea cables and pipelines. And I think we have seen a significant professionalization of the responses. Most recently, I think the Nordic-Baltic responses have been really exemplary in many ways. And in this sense, I think we can start considering the Baltic Sea region as a bit of a laboratory that will be able to export lessons learned to other operational theaters, whether that is in the High North or in the Indo-Pacific. That said, the consensus among defense officials we spoke to from the region in recent months was their worry that the worst is yet to come with these attacks and incidents on subsea cables. And of course, there are some gaps and challenges still in how we can best respond to and protect against these incidents. Most military and government officials, I think, are very aware of these. These are difficult questions to solve, and often there are no easy answers. So I'm going to structure my comments around the sort of well-established strands of any response to hybrid warfare, namely attribution, deterrence, and resilience, and focus specifically on deterrence and resilience, where I see most open potential, if you want, for the EU to contribute added value. So starting with deterrence, and specifically deterrence by punishment, I want to acknowledge at the outset that punishment in this field, of course, is difficult because attributing actions and proving intentionality is difficult. European leaders are right, I think, not to lower their standards for public attribution, and they are right to want to avoid the trap of attributing a hostile measure to a state actor without having committed to seeing through a response. Attribution without retribution makes European leaders weak and out of control, which is, again, the original goal of hybrid attacks. But the fact that attribution is hard does not change the fact that Europe has to act to deter potential attackers. So the first point I want to make here, and this will not come as news to anyone who has followed the responses to recent incidents, is that our legal framework is insufficient. Professor Büger already mentioned this. Under the United Nations Law of the Sea, coastal states have jurisdiction to arrest vessels that are suspected of damaging undersea infrastructure in their territorial waters, beyond their territorial waters, in states' exclusive economic zones, and on the high seas. Criminal jurisdiction for intentional subsea cable damage is reserved for a ship's flag state and not the state or states connected to the damaged cables. And only the 1884 Convention for Protection of Submarine Cables, of which several European states are not signatories, allows warships the ability to board a vessel suspected of intentionally damaging a cable outside of territorial waters. And even in this case, jurisdiction for punishing that damage still remains with the ship's flag state. Now, we did coordinate our remarks a little, and I will leave it to Dr. Lott to get into the weeds on options for legal innovation here. But I do want to make the case that some deterrence by punishment options are available to European member states already if they want to use them. First, I think the EU should prompt all coastal states to review their domestic laws and regulations and update where necessary to ensure that subsea cables, landing stations are, one, identified as critical infrastructure, and that both intentional and accidental damage to subsea cables in their territorial waters is associated with legal repercussions. This is against the background, of course, that crews claim accidental damage by arguing, for example, that they didn't notice their anchor dragging for miles. That should not matter. Negligence has to have consequences too. Second, I think Europeans could also exert more pressure on any flag state of vessels damaging critical European infrastructure. So, for instance, the EU could impose economic costs, such as making access to EU maritime infrastructure projects conditional on zero involvement in damaging European subsea infrastructure. And I think any EU legal expert body, I support this suggestion by Professor Büger, should of course be set up to cooperate closely with the NATO legal expert body that has just been set up a couple of weeks ago. Moving on to deterrence by denial, so the implementation of operational obstacles that can act as straightforward constraint. I'll be brief here. The obvious path is to enhance surveillance and monitoring. As you know, NATO and the Joint Expeditionary Force, JEF, have already both coordinated military monitoring and surveillance missions, which rely in part on US software platforms for big data analysis. The EU should invest in joint research and development of technologies that can help with underwater surveillance, like drones, like advanced sensors. This is in part already happening through PESCO, but I would recommend that funding for these technologies also becomes a part of future work programs for the EDF. And in this context, I want to talk briefly also about the need to deconflict collaboration with subsea infrastructure operators, telecoms companies, but also tech giants like Microsoft, Google, Meta, Amazon. I think it's a cliche almost in this space to recommend closer cooperation with the private sector, but it is worth thinking through why private companies might be disincentivized to share data with governments or institutions. In part, that is down to the reputational cost that comes with sharing data on cable breaks. And there can be a conflict of interest here at a time when government actors are often keen to call out sabotage. So collaboration from the private sector requires, I think, an incentive structure that can guarantee secure and private data sharing and really the building up of trust in this space. Now, moving on to resilience, I think the most effective signal to send to Moscow or any other disruptor in this space is that their sabotage actions are ultimately ineffectual. And I see two areas where the EU can usefully intervene here. The first is on bounce-back resilience, so in other words, repair. As many of you will know, and as Professor Büger already mentioned, the global repair fleet is small, it's aging, it's nearly exclusively in the hands of the private sector. Many repair ships also lay cables, and laying is more profitable than repair, which influences how resources get allocated. And of the limited number of repair ships that exist, many are not able to service heavier power cables. So the United States has established a cable security fleet where 2 private repair vessels are available to service cables connected to the United States during emergencies. And we have argued in the past that the EU should adopt a similar approach. Brussels could, like the US, partner with one of Europe's cable industry leaders to guarantee a certain number of repair vessels are available to service European data cables, power cables in crisis scenarios. I understand that conversations to this end are now beginning, which I think is great. This would be useful not just in the European theater, but also, for instance, in the Indo-Pacific, where the US, some of Europe's allies, have expressed concerns over Chinese repair ships. In a theater like that, where the conversation on subsea cables has become very, very securitized, and where many of our allies feel trapped in the great power competition between the US and China, I think the EU support to help increase resilience could be seen as very, very helpful. And then finally, the second area where the EU can usefully intervene in the context of resilience is on redundancies. So when we're talking about fiber optic cables, Europeans are fortunate in many cases to be able to rely on many redundancies so that isolated cable cuts rarely have significant impacts on the public because data can be rerouted. But of course, that does not protect against a coordinated act of sabotage against several cables at the same time. There are several choke points, particularly in European island states, that could easily be disrupted this way. We just saw a couple of weeks ago Iceland exercising that worst-case scenario. As you know, Europeans are already jointly funding new projects to increase the number of available redundancies to the EU. In this context, I would recommend that EU funding for cable projects under the Connecting Europe facility digital is maximized for geopolitical relevance. So the CEF already ensures that all beneficiaries of its grants are EU-controlled entities, and the cables deployed are built with secure technology, which is excellent. But in the most recent CEF digital call for proposals, even though applicants are encouraged to demonstrate that their project has geostrategic importance, these projects are not evaluated on that merit. And so far, each year, more projects are funded without significant increases in total money allocated. So it would make sense for those evaluating the proposals, I think, to focus on a select number of strategically important projects. For example, the EU could choose to prioritize subsea cable construction projects in the Arctic as a rapidly emerging strategic region. We've already allocated some funding to separate Arctic cable projects, but I think more can be done, including support for cable laying and repair ships with icebreaking capabilities. That is certainly a focus here in Washington. So with that, I hope there were some suggestions there that were sufficiently concrete and actionable, and I'll end here and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In Washington, it's 6 o'clock in the morning, so thank you really that you join us. So thank you. And now finally, Dr. Lott, who is also with us online. Could you elaborate on the different legal challenges related to the jurisdiction and ownership of undersea cables, but also the ownership of suspected vessels that could limit our ability to respond to demands by hybrid activities? You also have the floor for 10 minutes. And we could see you also. That's perfect.
Dear members of the committee and audience, co-panelists, thank you for your invitation to join this important hearing. Slide 2, please. The incidents in the Baltic Sea in the past 14 months all involved a foreign commercial ship abusing its right to anchor in the exclusive economic zone under the freedom of navigation. The absence of a clear European rulebook on naval operations creates legal uncertainty for responding to such incidents. But the Baltic Sea coastal states are considering avenues for increasing the legal resilience of their critical infrastructure in the exclusive economic zone. For example, Poland amended its law on the protection of seaports and shipping, and the Estonian government has prepared amendments to the Penal Code, the Estonian Defence Forces Organisation Act, and the EZ Act. Next slide. In these cases, the aim is to reduce the current sharp distinction, especially in law enforcement acts, in relation to maritime areas within and beyond the outer limit of the territorial sea. This enables the coastal state to make better use of jurisdictional grey zones under international law in time-critical situations. Still, legally speaking, the question remains about whether the coastal state can board, inspect, and seize a commercial ship in the EEZ if it damages the coastal state's critical offshore infrastructure. In my view, even under current international law, the answer to this question is positive. But there are important caveats. Most importantly, the right of interdiction is much more complex in relation to cable cuts, since they do not cause environmental pollution, unlike pipeline ruptures. Next slide. In this context, we should be open to the idea of progressive development or reinterpretation of the Law of the Sea Convention. For example, universal jurisdiction has been granted over piracy and unauthorized broadcasting on the high seas and the exclusive economic zone. Now, could a reinterpretation of Article 113 of the UNCLOS provide such grounds also in respect of ships suspected of damaging submarine pipelines and cables outside the territorial sea? Or could the EU take the initiative to develop new treaty law to explicitly grant such universal enforcement jurisdiction? In addition, the Danish, New Zealand, and Australian legislation seem to signal that, in principle, it is possible to establish safety zones around submarine cables and pipelines, also in the exclusive economic zone. Safety zones do not impede on the navigation of ships not suspected of damaging critical offshore infrastructure. Yet, according to the common view, including, for example, Norway's, this practice is not supported by the UNCLOS. If we accept that safety zones cannot be established around cross-border submarine cables in the EEZ under the UNCLOS, then we need to look for a complementary legal basis that would enable to board foreign flagged ships. Such, though much more limited legal basis, might stem from customary international law of the plea of necessity, or from Article 10 of the 1884 Paris Convention. For example, the United States considers that the said provision forms part of customary international law. Now, would the EU be interested in adopting a similar position? These possible reinterpretations of the UNCLOS might be considered as a sort of creeping jurisdiction by some. Yet they could provide, in combination with other legal concepts, including the right of hot pursuit, an effective measure for closing the security gap currently embedded in the UNCLOS. Next slide. The Baltic Sea and the North Sea include several international straits that are subject to different legal regimes. I have identified most of them on this map. Because of their geographical characteristics, straits contain a high concentration of critical offshore infrastructure, not only submarine data and electricity cables, but also pipelines, road, and rail tunnels. Next slide. To what extent can we close these gates of the Baltic Sea and the North Sea to tankers belonging to the so-called Russian shadow fleet? Here, we are mostly concerned with the following passage regimes. First, the right of transit passage, which currently applies in the Strait of Dover. Second, freedom of navigation and overflight, which applies in the easy corridors of the Fehmarn, Kattegat, and Bornholmsgat Straits, as well as in the Gulf of Finland. And thirdly, a specific passage regime subject to a historic treaty, which is the case of the Danish Straits. Now, it is difficult for me to believe that Denmark would not take any measures against a foreign ship if its passage through the Danish Straits proper were prejudicial to the peace, good order, or security of Denmark within the meaning of Article 19, Section 1 of the UNCLOS. Should we allow a ship suspected of conducting a hybrid operation against a Danish ally to freely transit through the Danish territorial sea in the Great Belt or Öresund? Would it not pose a threat to the numerous objects of critical offshore infrastructure located therein? Ultimately, though, any enforcement measures pursuant to this line of argumentation would depend on the progressive interpretation of the 1857 Copenhagen Convention in the context of the development of the international law of the sea, including the regime of straits in the 20th century. Next slide. In any event, the Great Belt and Öresund are not the only straits that commercial ships need to use on their long journey to or from the Russian Baltic Sea ports. So let's have a quick look at the legal regime of the other choke points in the area. The southern Baltic Strait states Denmark, Sweden, and Germany have established easy corridors, so to say, artificially, by way of limiting, under their domestic law, the outer extent of their territorial sea in the Kattegat and Femern Straits, as well as in Bornholmsgat. Those straits would be otherwise located entirely within the limits of the territorial sea of the coastal states. An easy corridor has been also established by Finland and Estonia in the Gulf of Finland. Next slide. This raises the question if the abolishment of an easy corridor in an international strait would increase the range of enforcement measures that a Baltic Sea coastal state could adopt against the environmental threats posed by the Russian shadow fleet, including the submarine cables. If the easy corridors would be abolished, then navigation through these straits would not be subject of the right of innocent passage. Instead, the right of transit passage would apply. This would bring about significant negative consequences to the coastal state. But, on the other hand, it would also increase the coastal state's enforcement rights in the area against foreign flag ships. For example, the question arises as to whether a right of interdiction exists in relation to the Russian shadow fleet in straits subject to the regime of transit passage. In my view, the answer is affirmative. This concerns currently the Strait of Dover, but potentially also the other Baltic straits that include this, so to say, artificially easy corridor. Next slide, please. According to Article 233 of the UNCLOS, it is not a precondition for taking enforcement measures against a foreign ship in transit passage that an environmental damage has already occurred. By contrast, absent of the oil spill or gas leakage, it appears that this is not possible under Article 220 of the UNCLOS that is applicable in the EZ. So the wording of Article 233 is much more flexible than that of Article 220. It seems to me that should an EEZ corridor be abolished in a strait, then under Article 233 of the UNCLOS, the coastal state may board, inspect, and, if necessary, seize a foreign ship caught dragging its anchor if it threatens to, for example, damage the Baltic Connector pipeline. There is no clear time limit set for preventive action, so it is possible to respond in a timely manner, thereby also preventing cable cuts in, for example, the Gulf of Finland. In addition, it should be noted that in 2005, the International Maritime Organization recognized both the Baltic Sea as well as the Torres Strait as particularly sensitive sea areas. In this context, I would raise a question that has not been discussed so far at all. In the rather unlikely event of the potential abolishment of the EEZ corridor in the Gulf of Finland, could Estonia and Finland follow the example of Australia that established a compulsory pilotage in the Torres Strait? Practically speaking, the previous maritime casualties, severe winter navigation conditions, and dense maritime traffic in the Gulf of Finland point to the direction that there would be some merit in such a proposal. Next slide. However, the establishment of compulsory pilotage in the Gulf of Finland would have to be preceded by the abolishment of the EEZ corridor in the area. This would create new opportunities for conducting hybrid operations against Estonia and Finland. The compulsory pilotage would also have to be approved first by the IMO. For a number of reasons, this is somewhat unlikely to happen. Yet, at least in theory, by way of implementing compulsory pilotage, Estonia and Finland could essentially avoid the anchor dragging of foreign flagships in the Gulf of Finland. In essence, the current extensive NATO as well as national naval operations in the area could be replaced with a pilotage mission. So, from a legal perspective, any effective measures for closing the current security gap in relation to the protection of critical underwater infrastructure would likely negatively impact on the freedom of navigation. This seems to be the price states would have to pay for safeguarding the underwater choke points of the internet and energy transportation outside the limits of the territorial sea. Recognizing the coastal state's right of interdiction, that is in relation to a ship that is caught red-handed in the EEZ for the damage caused to underwater infrastructure and for preventing further destruction of cables and pipelines, is necessary to respond to the challenges posed by hybrid warfare at sea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to members for a first round of questions, starting with the coordinators for 2 minutes, please. Nicolas.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for the complete insight into the issue in this public hearing, which is very interesting indeed. I think that one of the main worries concerning the surveillance of the undersea cable is they need to be sure that it is a sabotage or it's not an accident or an incident. I mean, that there is intentionality, obviously. And that's where we come to the attribution of responsibility. And here, in order to keep our credibility, we have to be 100% sure that we name and shame the responsible and no other. We have been seeing now in the press in the last weeks that we have name and shame the shadow fleet of Russia, even Chinese operating in the Baltic Sea and the waters. Apparently was not totally sure there was an incident or not. I think that here we have to be extremely serious in order not to lose credibility. We cannot fail in the attribution of responsibilities. And for that, I think that we need at least 3 things. The first thing is that we have to ask ourselves if we have enough cutting technology in order to underwater surveillance. And obviously here we have to cooperate with the private enterprise and to do it in a better way. The second point is that once we have this cutting-edge technology, the exchange of information among member states. And here again, I think that here we have to make an effort in order to streamline, to accelerate the exchange of information, because we arrive always late in these cases. How we can improve this exchange of information is a point of reflection. And the third point is to go public or not. It is politically interesting to go public and to name and shame, or not doing it. And if we do it, how to do it collectively or individually. And it's something that it is a political matter, obviously. And finally, last but not least, to increase our cooperation with the US fleet of surveillance and to try to carry out joint drills with the US in this particular field. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tobias.
Thank you very much also from my end to the experts. I'm very glad that this is becoming a more important topic here. In my previous life, I was a career diplomat and in my last posting responsible as a desk officer for the Baltic countries and the Baltic region. So I'm very glad that this is now becoming a higher priority, which brings me immediately to the question, and that is one of attribution, resilience, and ultimately also threat perception, because in some ways you've pointed to a dilemma we face with, on the one hand, we need to be very, very clear when it comes to attribution, when it comes to then consequences. But on the other hand, and we need to be careful with that, and we might even want to have a certain level of ambiguity when we talk to those perpetrating it, if we talk about it in diplomatic, geopolitical ways. But I think on the other hand, we have the challenge of social resilience, and also the challenge of how do we show to our populations, first, that we are aware of the threat, and second, that we are acting against the threat. And I think there is a strong perception in the population that there's uncertainty because we have information going both ways. Is this actually sabotage? Should we call it sabotage? And if so, what can be done about it? And I'd be very intrigued to hear your view to what extent, and I know it's also different for members of parliament as, for instance, for representatives of state. Is it useful if we call it what it is, sabotage? Or do you think their ambiguity would be better as well? And then the second question is, what can we do? And there very concretely, one of the actions that we have often called for are concrete sanctions, for instance, against the Russian shadow fleet. Is that something that is actually an appropriate response? Does it show effect? Because on the other hand, you said they were actually responding, or some of the attacks were actually responses to that. Is that a good sign or a bad sign, very concretely? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pierre Romain.
Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais poser...
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question in French, if I may. Thank you very much for your presentations. I think it really goes beyond the recent events in the Baltic Sea. We're seeing different phenomena come together, legal, economic, military factors. I think your presentations show that more and more, as we see the development of marine infrastructure, whether undersea or not, undersea cables, wind turbines, the different resources you might find underwater, the sea seems to be more and more saturated with human activities. And we have a certain legal vacuum where there's less distinction between what is marine or terrestrial. So that was an initial question to pose you. Do you think we are moving towards a less clear definition of what is marine, what is land-based, and a perhaps more liberal, open definition of access to the sea? And then secondly, leading on from that legal issue, if we look at the Baltic Sea, there is less and less difference between what is civil and what is military. It becomes harder to say what is part of a maritime strategy for activities at sea and what's more naval or military. So my question would be, do you see less distinction there between land and sea? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rainis.
Labdien, latviski runāšu.
I will speak in Latvian. Good afternoon. Since I come from Latvia, the events in the Baltic Sea are very important to me, obviously. Thank you very much for all the presentations that we have heard today. We heard a lot of comprehensive information, including also legal explanations. It is true, it is not that important whether we're talking about sabotage or captains that do not know what they're doing and cannot take care of their anchors. But it is very clear that our reaction, our action, both if we invest into surveillance and follow up, it is true that our hands are tied due to the law of the sea. There are many things that need to be done, so I would just like to thank you once again for explaining the situation, for being precise, and coming up with proposals on what we could do and what we should do. It is clear that the Baltic Sea is not the only one that has cables. under the water, and these situations might repeat and repeat more often in the future. So it is clear to me that without proper changes in the law of the sea and the regulations, we need to allow the member states to act. Without this, we will not be moving anywhere in protecting our cables. Well, at the same time, yes, indeed, it does seem it will be a long process. There are many tricky things to do, but we need to take care of the legal basis so we can act if the need arises. This is not a question, actually, it was just a comment, and I wanted to thank you very much once again for your presentation. Let us really look at the future and move rapidly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petras. And everybody, we have now enough seats. If you want to sit down, please take a seat. It's much more comfortable. So, Petras.
Thank you, Chair, and I do thank you, all the speakers, for excellent presentations and indeed very insightful remarks and some suggestions for policymakers. Firstly, to Professor Berger. Professor, indeed, the infrastructure for laying down cables and, even maintaining and repairing is much in Chinese hands, a lot of Chinese companies. I mean, do you see any tendency for Western partners, to really, for a need to invest more and to get this capacity for building up cables as well as maintenance services, which must be, I guess, more in Western side? Secondly, a second question to you. To what extent this underwater infrastructure must be attached to the concept of military mobility of the European Union? Because we are moving data, and data is a strategic part of our defense capacity. Are there any thoughts on this? Then to Sophia Besch. Well, a cable connecting Lithuania and Sweden was damaged by the Chinese vessel, which was detained later. To what extent Chinese policies, I'm speaking about, for example, situation in Taiwan waters. We know that some cables were damaged. Can be an example for considering not just Russian shadow fleet. It's not just Russian shadow fleet, Chinese as well. So that's why, can you comment on this? And thirdly, to Dr. Lott. To what extent we can apply terrorism law against all those crimes? I call it crimes. They are not accidents. Let's stop being naive in this regard. Everything is organized. Nothing happens in itself. And to what extent we can, manage better by law shadow fleet? I'm speaking about the law of the sea. I don't see enough of efforts in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Petras. And now Willy for the Greens.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for brilliant presentations with a broad range of possibilities to act. I have three questions. One about security zones. It sounds easy. Are there any problems with international law of sea, which makes it difficult to create these security zones, as one question? And once they are established, the big problem is how to control that they are respected. You have some views upon that. About the shadow fleets, what the Finnish did was to board a ship with a helicopter, and the military took control of the ship. Is that possible, or was that on the edge of international law? Could we manage it that way? Does that give some possibilities? Because these shadow fleets are not only giving problems to financing the Russian war, they're also giving problems to a huge environmental catastrophe if something happens. And I think if we could set some good examples, it might be with a great risk that companies were sailing, if we could take these ships out. Are there some limitations to international law here? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now for the left, Marina.
Merci Madame la Présidente, merci à tous.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chair, and thank you for all those presentations concerning a real challenge for our economies and the way in which we both install and protect our subsea cables. So 95% of global internet traffic transits these cables, and you've got $10,000 billion in financial transactions on a daily basis, which just goes to show the strategic interest in protecting and controlling those cables. And as many of the speakers have said, we are sorely lacking resources when it comes to safeguarding the cables. There are only about 40 or so cable companies, and we have just 9 in Europe and just 1 for maintaining all of the Atlantic and Baltic subsea cables. Now, we have looked more specifically at the Baltic Sea this morning. I'm from Marseille myself, and I'm very alive to the plight of the Mediterranean Sea, and we have the cables which link 57 countries with 5 billion users, and I want to know what your view of the risk to Mediterranean subsea cables is, because as a European Union and also countries on the southern shores of the Mediterranean, we need to be looking at taking certain measures. Then there's, of course, the deterioration of the cables as a result of climate change. The Mediterranean Sea, as you will be aware, is heating up more quickly than the global average. So my question is as to the kind of strategy we should be adopting to this critical infrastructure in the Mediterranean Sea so as to adapt to climate change. Thank you.
So for the sovereigns, nobody's here. Okay, then we could start with the answers. Many questions. So we start with Dr. Lott, then Dr. Besch, and then Professor Bürger. Please, Dr. Lott.
There was a question about to what extent can we apply terrorism law and to what extent we can manage better the Russian shadow fleet under the law of the sea. Well, under the Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against the Safety of Maritime Navigation...
sorry, could you switch on your camera? If it's possible. Yeah, yes. Wonderful to see you. You are not sitting on the moon, that's good. Okay, please.
So indeed, under the SUA Convention, an offence includes the discharge of explosives from a ship or the use of a ship in a manner that causes death or serious injury or damage. However, the coastal state cannot board the suspected ship without the express authorization of the flag state still. Similar limitations apply under the Convention for the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings. However, in the Arctic Sunrise case, the Law of the Sea Convention's Annex 7 Arbitral Tribunal indicated that it might be lawful for the coastal state to take additional preventive enforcement measures in the EEZ against a suspected terrorist attack. So there might be some room of maneuver at play. Regarding the challenges posed by the Russian shadow fleet in general under the law of the sea, I'm afraid that the legal framework of the exclusive economic zone under the law of the sea convention does not provide for, let's say, effective measures currently to respond to the challenges posed by these substandard and poorly insured tankers. Because under Article 220 that I referred to in my presentation as well, the, let's say, precondition for the coastal state to take any enforcement measures against such a tanker is that you must already have some sort of environmental pollution, either let's say, an oil spill or let's say some sort of gas leakage, you cannot act properly preventively. However, in the gates of the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, here we are talking about the straits, such as the Strait of Dover, where you have the right of transit passage at play. The regime is somewhat different, this legal regime. Under Article 233, the coastal state, either France or the UK, may also take preventive measures in cases where there is no real marine environmental pollution already occurred in the marine environment, but it might occur. So in these cases, for example, the UK might consider taking some sort of enforcement action against a foreign tanker, similar to the Grace 1 incident a few years ago, in the case of which the UK Royal Marines and the Gibraltar law enforcement officials spotted the Grace 1 tanker that was suspected of carrying oil in violation of the EU sanctions regime to Syrian ports. But still, in these cases, in this hypothetical scenario in which the UK would take such rapid enforcement measures, the tankers could still use the roundabout route and instead heading to the Strait of Dover, take the route around the UK and Ireland, which is barely 800 kilometers longer than the shortcut through the Strait of Dover. So essentially, still under the current Law of the Sea Convention regime, I would say that the key to taking more rapid enforcement measures against the Russian shadow fleet lies in the regime of straits, Part 3 of the Law of the Sea Convention, in respect to the Danish Straits and, let's say, the Gulf of Finland in particular. This partly perhaps also answers the question related to whether our hands are tied in relation to taking enforcement action against ships suspected of damaging critical underwater infrastructure under the Law of the Sea Convention. In my presentation, I tried to demonstrate that our hands are not really tied. It is rather a matter of how we interpret the Law of the Sea Convention and how we strike the balance between the freedom of navigation on the one hand with, on the other hand, the protection of these really important objects of underwater infrastructure. So it is partly a political decision that needs to be taken. But clearly, when the Law of the Sea Convention was adopted in 1982, it was not foreseen that, let's say, submarine cables and pipelines play such a crucial role in our contemporary society that is not only, let's say, oil-based and freedom of navigation-based, but also very much reliant on the free flow of the internet and electricity transportation. So, indeed, partly it is a matter of reinterpretation of the Law of the Sea Convention as well.
Dr. Lott, sorry about it. Now I have to stop you. Sorry, because we have two other guests. But sorry, I realize that there is no possibility for you for translation. We have a technical problem. Or it's now okay? Did you hear? Maybe you could hear Romania. It's okay now. It's okay now? Oh, okay. So then we continue with Dr. Besch. No, it's okay. No, they switched over. Okay, whatever. It's a miracle. The European Parliament, it's a miracle. So, and yeah, okay, Dr. Besch, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you so much for really, really excellent comments and questions. I'm going to come back to 3 points, maybe 3.5. The first one is on strategic communication and resilience. I was glad to the speaker who brought this up. I think maintaining societal cohesion in this context is really another element of resilience against disruptions to critical infrastructure. And achieving that cohesion requires strategic communication from leaders. And that includes clear messaging that any damage done did not achieve its intended effect, and that any identified culprits are going to be held responsible. And I think intra-European coordination is crucial in this context to avoid contradictory or unclear messaging to the public, especially, yes, in the context of attribution. And I spoke about this in my initial remarks, so I'm not going to get into it again in too much depth, but I agree with the speakers who underlined the challenges related to attribution. I don't think those challenges should paralyze us. There are a lot of other actions we can take below the level of public attribution in terms of resilience and deterrence. And I think we saw some really great examples of Nordic-Baltic coordination on that point recently. Then on the question of the link with China, so again, really glad to the speaker for bringing this up. I think the effects of any measures that are going to be taken by European governments in the Baltic Sea are going to have implications around the world. And so Europe has an opportunity here to lead a global push with partners to better protect subsea data energy cables through improved legal standards and expanded trusted networks too. So, any new legal interpretations that we devise for the Baltic Sea have to be applicable to other operational theaters too. And so those exchanges, I think, make sense from the outset. We should proactively coordinate with global partners like Australia, like Japan, like Taiwan. I think Europe could, for instance, host a follow-up convening for signatories of the New York Joint Statement. I think we should probably, and that is already happening, but much more EU-NATO coordination when it comes to reaching out to global partners in the Indo-Pacific. I mentioned at the outset this idea of the Baltic Sea being a bit of a laboratory for this issue, able to possibly export lessons learned. The South China Sea obviously is another laboratory, and they have been dealing with this issue for a long time, and in many cases there are fewer redundancies for the island states there. And as I mentioned in my initial remarks, the great power competition between the US and China is really felt by the stakeholders, smaller countries in that region, many of them European partners, where resilience is really of prime importance for them to protect the economic significance of particularly data cables for that region. And so I think there's great opportunity there for European outreach and collaboration. And then final point on the civil-military coordination challenge. So one issue we heard highlighted in our conversations again and again is the issue of international interagency coordination. As you know, subsea cables, pipelines are largely owned by civilian companies, and so responses have to be coordinated with civilian and military actors. Depending on the circumstance, any response could involve the police, Coast Guard, military forces. And so that means that countries with subsea cables connecting to their shores have to sort out the interagency processes between the various domestic actors involved in a response to ensure that they're able to react swiftly. And I want to stress on that point because while it is so important that the EU takes a greater role here, I think it cannot lead to countries kicking the can up the road, if you will, and abandoning, their domestic, national, regional, local responsibilities to sort out these processes. But then next, and that is crucially important, especially in areas like the Baltic Sea with congested territorial waters where incidents nearly always affect multiple countries, of course, interstate coordination is a must. But often, countries do not follow uniform interagency processes for reacting to subsea infrastructure damage, or their agencies are just not used to talking to each other. And that means that deepened regional cooperation between, for instance, the Baltic and the Nordic states is going to be necessary not just at the military level through NATO or the JEF, but also at the level of coast guards, police, private operators, and that is really something that we should encourage. I'm going to end here just to say that I'm really glad that in particular the repair fleet suggestion is so well perceived, and I look forward to seeing action on that front. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Besch, and now Professor Christian Berger. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the comments and questions. A lot to chew on, quite obviously. Firstly, we are indeed looking at a major transformation in terms of our relationship to the sea. If you look into all statistics in terms of human activities at sea, it is going up, 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 up. Our dependency on the sea is massively increasing, and that will continue in particular in the light of the green transition. That basically means maritime security is no longer a niche topic. If you have thought about this is something that can be done with in a separate side strategy, the maritime security strategy, and it's not really important, this is no longer the case. Maritime security always has been a civilian as well as a military domain, and interagency coordination indeed is crucial. The European solution has always been to talk about Coast Guard functions to overcome this distinction that member states have radically different ways of organizing maritime security. Let me also reiterate the point how important it is actually how we interpret the law of the sea. I think we have many more options in terms of what we can do, in particular if it comes to coastal state provisions, both in terms of the shadow fleet, in terms of the protection of subsea data cables, but we should also think beyond that. Think, for instance, about the question, should we allow the Russian Navy to conduct naval exercises in European exclusive economic zones? I don't think we should. And this is basically down to how we interpret the exclusive economic zone provisions in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. There are several countries which deny that possibility to foreign states. Do we also want to take that position? Where are we going to decide that? Hence the call for a body of experts that actually choose through these options and works towards a genuine European understanding of the law of the sea. Russian spy vessels. We think they're conducting research and should be covered under the freedom of scientific research. Probably not. But then we have to say that, and we have to agree as Europeans what our understanding is of what constitutes a research vessel and what not. I agree that much of the harm we are actually talking about is on the level of societies, societal uncertainty. The actual economic damage is quite marginal. And here we have to be really, really cautious, because let's not forget, accidents happen. Cable cuts happen frequently, and they have done so before the Ukraine war, and they will also continue to do so in the future. So we need to be very, very cautious here in terms of how we handle these situations. The solution, again, here is to Europeanize our response. And now we not only need better technologies and better information sharing, identifying what is an accident and what is potentially an act of sabotage requires technical expertise. It's a special subset of investigations. So we need to have this level of expertise on a European level, and ideally it would be hosted in Frontex or EMSA. Lastly, I think it's time that we are also talking not only about the Baltic and the North Sea or the North Atlantic, but also about the Mediterranean and also beyond. Keep in mind the Ruby Mar incident from last year. Houthi rebels shot down a vessel. It was lingering. It cut down major cables connecting India and Europe. Did the European naval force, the European Operation Aspides, respond to that? No. It's clearly not seen to be in their mandate. I think EU naval operations in more general terms should start incorporating and paying attention to critical maritime infrastructure protection in the Mediterranean. That includes IRINI. And quite obviously, I think there's a lot of potential to also use the problem of critical maritime infrastructure protection in our diplomatic conversation with the North African countries, use vehicles such as the Mediterranean Coast Guard Function Forum, for instance, to do that. Maritime security is also always an opportunity to engage and talk about security differently, so let's not forget that crucial dimension to the entire topic here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have two more who are want to ask something. It's Pekka and Helda. So please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very good for presentations and good opinions. And I think we have learned a lot of different solutions to these problems. And what is, of course, clear that there's not one silver bullet. We need a wide range of activities, whether it's changing the laws all the way to have a better technology to support us. My personal thing is that we need two things. First, we need to be proactive. We heard a lot of a discussion about how to react when the cable is cut. And then we lost already a lot. We should be more proactive so that we can intervene before the cable is cut, which of course requires a lot of technology and a lot of cooperation, but it is possible. I think so. Another thing is that then we have to put a proper price tag. We never will be able to put Russia to pay for it because we can prove that they are behind it, but we can make everybody else to pay. Eagle S, which is in Finnish custody, is a good example. The damage it caused is over 30 million euros. We can't touch the cargo because it's owned by somebody else. The ship is worth nothing. It's a worthless chunk. We have to go after the owners. We have to go after the captain himself, so that we make them responsible and get the money back, so to say. If its price is too high, people don't allow themselves to be proxies for Russian activities. And it would be nice to hear Commission's views, because we've heard, again, dozen different methods we could do. What is the Commission's work plan? What are we going to do, and in what order to start taking care of these actions? Again, and I prefer to be proactive rather than reactive in these cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Helda?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for your presentations and for your presence today here in the committee meeting. In my opinion, we have three different aspects, and we share with us these three ones. The first one, the legal aspects. But in the international scenario, in my opinion, also takes time to fix and to change the international law, because we know what's happened in the EU and also in the UN, in the UN situation, in the UN Council, and it's so difficult to have the full agreement to change the international law. And I fully agree with my colleague Pekka, because we need to act today and not tomorrow, and I cannot guess how long it takes to change the law. And the time is money, and the time is sovereignty also, and we are losing the sovereignty. The second issue, and I was, when I was young, I was an IT and comms engineer, the technical aspects. And for me, it's the easiest issue, because with the intelligent cables and with the redundancy, we reduce the risk. Okay, we have ways to reduce the risk, and it is a technical aspect. The third one, it's the political aspect, and we are politicians acting as politicians. And the first question is, did you support the need to revisit the EU strategy of protection of critical infrastructures and upgrade the requirements? Because now we have this strategy already on the field. And the second one, Chair, how can the common and the defense policy, I mean the CSDP, be leveraged to
Sorry, we have a lot of questions. Sorry to interrupt you. We have another questions and no. Okay. So Sebastian.
Thank you, Chair. We're now fighting symptoms of a disease for which we make ourselves more and more vulnerable. We use the sea more and more, for example, so the undersea safety, maritime safety is becoming more and more of an issue. So we're now focusing on the Baltic Sea, and I'm happy with the final remarks of Mr. Burger, where he said, well, we need to expand our focus because Mediterranean, we know our enemy now, but we don't know our next enemy, we don't know the next threat. So one of my questions was going to be, where's the next threat going to pop up? Because we don't know at this moment. And can we do more in prevention-wise? And I know I'm approaching this a little bit too simplistic maybe, but if one of the problems is ships dragging their anchors over the sea floor, why don't we bury our cables on those spots, for example? And there's things like that we could do more through satellite communication or whatever. What are our options if we want to prevent this from ever happening? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Hannah, and then we will have the possibility for each of our guests 5 minutes. Please, Hannah.
Thank you. You said that most of the security infrastructure at the moment is carried by NATO, and indeed we have the NATO Task Force Baltic in Rostock, and we have Baltic Sentry. However, I mean, all of the capabilities of both of these missions are coming from EU countries alone. So I wouldn't say we heavily rely on NATO on this one. It's just the framework. My question is, given the capability step up that we have with the task force as well as Baltic Sentry, what is still lacking in terms of capabilities to really fully enforce this idea that such things never happen? And are these capabilities there in theory, or are we even lacking them if we sew together consistently member states' capabilities?
Thank you very much. So we start 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much for these questions. They all point towards the same direction, because we should not forget that we are looking at industries, right? So there are economic incentives in the background. So the reason why the cable industry is not digging deeper, so to say, is because it costs a lot of money, and that basically alters the business case for laying the cable in the first instance. The same goes with the question of, should we upgrade the requirements for critical maritime infrastructure protection? Yes, sounds like a fantastic idea, but it will cost the industry a lot of money. And let's not forget, if it comes to the green energy transition, we need more wind farms. So if it alters the economic calculation, then we might be in trouble. So hitting that balance right, not kind of like asking too much of the industry in terms of protection versus having the right minimum standards, that is the essence of the day. In terms of being proactive and adding price tags, we should also not forget the insurance industry in all of that, because part of the solution is also in the requirements that we put on insurance for vessels entering European coastal waters, including exclusive economic zones. If it comes to international law, we don't need to change international law. We just need to change our interpretation of the international law. If this body here today would come out with a statement saying that this committee agrees that navies should no longer be allowed to conduct exercises in exclusive economic zones of European Union member states, that would change the interpretation that many states have right now. And let's not forget that in many ways, the dominant understanding of UNCLOS is that of the United States. So we can revisit that. We can ask these questions. What is Europe's understanding of how we should interpret these provisions, including also the conventions by the International Maritime Organization and others? Last point, which capabilities do we actually need? A lot of developments are currently happening on the research and technology side, and that's applaudable. That includes smart cables, new drones, and much of this is actually being funded through the EU's Horizon program, so a lot of good things are underway. I think what we need in terms of capabilities is legal capabilities and investigative teams, criminal investigations. This is where we're falling short, and this is also what are the big lessons from the last couple of months in the Baltic Sea. We do not have the right way of handing over suspects. The majority of countries do not have criminal provisions for any kind of damages, and so on. So this is really what we need to start thinking about. And let me reiterate that again. We have the European Coast Guard Agency. We have the European Maritime Safety Agency. Where are they in this picture? And do we really want to accept that these agencies are reluctant to engage with the topic? I don't think so. They are maritime security agencies for the European Union, and in that sense, they should play a significant role in this.
Clear words. Thank you very much. Dr. Besch. Is she still there? Okay, perfect.
Can you hear me?
The floor is yours for 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, a couple of quick points. One on industry cooperation. I think I just want to underline what Professor Büger has said. I think it's not just about incentivizing industry in this context. It's also about holding them to account. And what we might want to do is look to the United States here and see what we can learn from this example, where the government directly works with a cable operator to ensure that 2 private repair vessels are available at all times to service cables connected to the United States during emergencies. Now, that comes with a price tag, of course, but it also comes with a different understanding of how U.S. companies are also responsible to support U.S. national security interests and not just their own economic bottom lines. And so I think this is the kind of attitude that the EU might also want to bring into its interactions with industry in Europe. On technology and capabilities, yes, there are some efforts underway looking into employing advanced technologies to bolster both attribution efforts but also protection efforts for subsea cable threats. Sensor technologies for underwater surveillance, AI for pattern recognition and data traffic, integrating cybersecurity tools to track digital footprints associated with physical tampering. I think those are all promising. There are also fairly basic ideas, and I'm glad to the speaker who pointed this out, for increasing the physical protection of cables. And that's especially an option for new cables that are being laid. It's more difficult to do that retroactively for the cables that have already been laid. Collaborating on technology development, sharing best practices across EU and NATO, I think, is essential to maintaining real-time monitoring, rapid response capabilities. I was glad to hear Hannah Neumann point out the European capabilities and capacities in this context. This is happening in our neighborhood, and I think we can confidently say that Europeans have taken the lead here. One point on that is that at times we do still heavily rely on US technology in this context, and also data processing companies in this context, like Palantir, for instance. And some projects, like the NATO fairly high-profile HEIST project, that is looking to reroute connectivity data to satellites requires real-time data analysis. And the greatest difficulty here lies in accessing the data. And again, coming back to this point of private cable operators, including tech giants, Microsoft, Google, Meta, Amazon, which play an increasingly ever bigger role in this space, are not at all keen on the idea of handing over this data. And so, again, there's a point here about changing, I think, our attitude with how we work with industry in this space and how we hold them to account. Final point on this, I think there's real added value for the EU here when it comes to funding. I mentioned it at the outset through PESCO, through the ADF. It's sort of a classic case for joint funding because we have a collective action problem in this space in that the coastal states are obviously directly affected and are taking action, but this is not just a coastal state issue. This affects everyone on the continent, all of our data cable security, all of our energy security, and I think this is why joint funding in this space is particularly relevant. Over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Lotz.
Thank you. Can you see me?
No, we can hear you. We
Yes,
couldn't see you, but now it's okay.
Okay. So I completely agree with the speakers who mentioned that we need to take a more broader perspective, not only focus on the Baltic Sea, because clearly...
Okay, just a minute, if it's okay for you, we have no possibility to translate it. No interpretation. Okay, everybody speaks English, please.
Yes?
Okay.
So, for example, we all know that, let's say, the highest concentration of critical offshore infrastructure is located in the North Sea, not in the Baltic Sea. Here we are talking of not only submarine cables, but also thousands of kilometers long network of submarine pipelines, underwater tunnels, wind farms, and so on. There was one of the committee members who mentioned that she's from Marseille. In 2022, actually, 3 cables connecting Marseille to Barcelona, to Milan, to Lyon were cut. And of course, in this particular case, also, it was suspected that it was an incident of sabotage. Well, it led to the internet speed between Asia and Europe to be reduced quite significantly because of these 3 cable cuts. Now, there was a question of the price tag. Mr. Toveri asked what should be the price tag for the legal persons if, for example, they cause a cable cut in the exclusive economic zone. Now, the amendments to the penal code of Estonia foresee that the price tag for the legal persons would be 4 billion euros, up to 4 billion euros. This is a very concrete price tag. And this should also, so to say, create some sort of deterrence, right? And here we also need to bear in mind that, of course, within the last 14 months, 3/4 of the Estonian submarine cables were cut in just 2 incidents. That is the Eagle S incident and the Neo Polar Bear incident. In the latest incident, that is the Eagle S incident, the Estonian and Finnish population suffered damage of, let's say, at least a couple of 100 million euros. For example, only the damage caused to the Estlink 2 power cable means that the electricity prices for the Estonians will rise for about 10% in a period of, let's say, up to a year long. The repair costs themselves cost tens of millions of euros. So indeed, we need to set a clear price tag, not only in specific Baltic Sea coastal states in respect of such cable cuts, either very real or rather, let's say, a perceived threat from the perspective of coastal states that have not yet experienced such incidents, for example, in the Mediterranean. There was a question about the potential of burying the cables on the bottom of the seabed. It's not always possible because of geological reasons. But if we look at the recent incidents, such as the New polar bear, the eagle-S, or perceived threats to the cables and other underwater infrastructure in the Strait of Dover, then the tankers need to follow the traffic separation schemes, which very much resemble the highways on land. And in these cases, it is possible for the coastal state authorities and the operators of these cables to provide an extra protective layer over the cables, which of course costs some money, but given that, let's say, the traffic separation schemes are, geographically speaking, not very wide, it's indeed possible to allocate reasonable budget for ensuring this extra resilience of these submarine cables in respect of these commercial ships that might drag their anchors on their journey through these traffic separation schemes. There was another question which was left unanswered and which was raised by the Danish member of the committee, how to ensure that the safety zones, or as he referred to them, security zones, would be complied with by the commercial ships. The short answer to this is the right of hot pursuit under Article 111 of the Law of the Sea Convention. So, for example, in the case of the most recent Eagle-S incident during the Christmas Day cable cuts, the Finnish were somewhat fortunate that the ship complied with the order to enter the Finnish territorial sea. But had it not complied with the order, then if the safety zones would have been established around these submarine cables in the Gulf of Finland, then this would automatically, under the Law of the Sea Convention, have provided the Finnish coastal authorities with the right to use their hot pursuit against the Eagle-S ship, board it, inspect it, and, if necessary, detain it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lott, and thank you, all of us, once again to our speakers for being with us today. Your expertise has been highly appreciated. We will closely monitor the situation in the SEDE committee, and I say thank you to all of our guests and to everybody who was here. It was great interest, great participation. This is really good. So thank you very much, and goodbye to our guests, and see you soon.